everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today, Carrie Gress, is a fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and she's a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. She is the editor of the online women's magazine, Theology of Home. Carrie has joined this podcast twice before to talk about her books, The Marian Option and The Anti-Mary Exposed, but the last time she came on was all the way back in early 2019, so over 4 years ago. Today, she's here to discuss her new book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. I'll note that we're recording this discussion on the Feast of the Nativity of Mary, so the end of woman, the beginning of woman, you could say the restoration of woman. Kind of an interesting confluence there. This book, I'm really happy that it was published because it fills an important gap in the critique of feminism, because it uncovers things in the early history of feminism that I would say even most Catholic critics of feminism either don't know about or aren't willing to touch. And I've actually kind of been waiting for someone to do it, to be honest. So very happy to have Carrie back on the show. Welcome back, Carrie.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Now, we were just talking about the fact that within a few minutes after recording our last conversation in early 2019, I was put in handcuffs and and thrown in a jail cell, which was still quite a memory for me. I was yeah. So I finished recording with you. And I walked out. Was rushing out the door to go to mass, an evening mass at my parish, taking the bus. And the bus was so packed, and I got on the back and couldn't make my way to the front to swipe my Metro card. And instead of the bus leaving, the doors opened again, and me and an older gentleman were escorted off the bus by police. And I really didn't know that it was a misdemeanor. Fare evasion, so I figured I would just be getting a ticket or a fine or something, but no, they started putting me in cuffs right there. And so I spent a couple hours in a holding cell, and then they processed me, and then I had to go to court, and and then they dismissed it. So that's quite
I remember that.
a vivid memory.
You were texting me from jail, like, you're not going to believe what just happened. So I have vivid memory of all of that unfolding shortly after our conversation.
Yeah, and this was the Friday before Good Friday, 2019, and so it was like I was just like, well, I guess this is good food for for meditation, but it was really just more like sort of surreal than anything else. Okay, so it's been 4 years. A lot has happened in the world since 2019. I'm sure plenty has happened in both of our lives. You've written this book, The End of Woman, published by Regnery, and I was mentioning, that this is going into things that other critics of feminism, at least in the sort of like the mainstream Catholic world, haven't really touched. And in my experience, the critique of feminism often runs something like, well, feminism started out as this thing, and they were just getting votes for women, and it was very pro-life because Susan B. Anthony was against abortion. And then in the 60s, the second wave feminism, they hijacked it. I've heard that word used, hijacked, co-opted, but, the implication is always that the early ones were compatible with Catholic views. Now, there's some groups like Feminists for Life or different pro-life feminist groups that will explicitly hail people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as the pro-life feminist foremothers that we should be hearkening back to. And so I was aware of more problematic elements of those early figures and the early history in the sort of like immediately post-Enlightenment era, just from reading a couple of articles here and there, but nothing that's well known in sort of Catholic circles. So I wanted to ask, how did you sort of start getting onto this? Because I don't know if were you aware of any of this back when we last talked from the early days of feminism?
No, I had only really looked back to the 1960s because this was the same thing I had always heard. I just had always had the sense that the first wave was much more pure and lovely. And so I thought, I just need to look into this. It was really one of those things that I had never really done the research myself. And I felt like it was this huge gap in my knowledge, whether I said something good about it or bad about it. And so I thought, oh, this will, last me a couple of days. I'll look through, the original sources of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Mary Wollstonecraft and whatnot. And, I'll pluck some nice quotes from them and I'm sure I'll move on. And of course, that's exactly what did not happen. I mean, I was astounded at what I discovered. And it was kind of one of those things like, yeah, I just kept pulling the string, it just kept more and more and more kept coming. And I started piecing things together. And, it just was really amazing to me to start seeing really what was in the first wave is, it was like all the pieces were there so that the second wave could sort of become the full bloom of what the first wave had already started with. So, yeah, I was shocked and amazed and really did not expect to write this book at all. But the more that I got into it, I realized, this is the problem. This is where it started. This is why we're seeing all the problems that we see now with the transgenderism and
Right.
the woke culture and all of this. It's all kind of born of these same ideas. So it was really amazing to sort of see this intellectual tradition, as a whole, instead of feeling like it was broken up and didn't make sense the way that I felt about it before.
Right. Well, I think it's very much a similar or even the same phenomenon of people wanting to criticize progressive leftism, but they want to
Mhm.
embrace classical liberalism. And
Mhm. Mhm.
or sort of like the benign, what they see as the benign version of Enlightenment liberalism, like the American version or something
Mhm.
like that, and they're not willing to sort of
Yeah.
go back and critique at least certain presuppositions of say the founders or the founding fathers
Yeah.
or things like that. I mean, I'm not saying we have to
Mhm.
reject these things wholesale, but there's certain people don't want to touch some of that stuff because it 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 attacks our own worldview, to
Mhm.
examine those things, because it's easy to
Yeah.
distinguish myself from a feminist who, says that, you know, says that she hates men or that, trans women are women or whatever. But
Mhm.
it's when you go back and look at, some of these liberties that we hold dear, to bring it back to the analogy to politics more generally.
Mhm.
You go back and then you read papal encyclicals from the 19th century that are critical of the idea of like absolute freedom of speech, for
Mhm.
instance, and there's you start to see
Mhm.
that there's some disconnects.
Mhm.
um so just as a point of information about your book, this is from Regnery. Your previous two books that we discussed on here were from Tan. This book is more for a
Mhm.
general audience, not specifically for a Catholic
Yeah.
audience, right?
No, absolutely. And that was part of the motivation for writing it also was that so many people read the Anti-Mary and said, can you write something that will be more Protestant friendly or secular friendly? And so everything just kind of came together. Matt Walsh, of course, was asking the question what a woman is. And I think that, I just wanted to kind of put more flesh on it too. Like how do we
Right.
speak of women in a more, with some real substance instead of just that blanket answer of an adult female human. And so that was kind of all these pieces really came together. And so in a certain respect it's kind of a prequel, if you will, to the
Right.
Anti-Mary. There's certainly some overlap, but then there's also a lot of new content too. But it certainly goes back further than what I focused on in the Anti-Mary Exposed.
Right. And now this book is really about telling the stories of different foundational figures
Mhm.
in feminism, right? And
Yeah.
and it's very much about, in a sense, making it about the persons. Now, um,
Mhm.
somebody might say this is like an ad hominem or something, and you should focus on the ideas. So what would be your
Mhm.
case for focusing in this particular book more on the
Yeah.
stories and what they were like and where
Right.
where these people were coming from in their personal lives?
Sure. No, I mean, I think the big thing is just really to make it a readable, engaging book. I think that, oftentimes as Catholics, we spend so much time, embedded in academia and in, writing products that the average person doesn't want to read, or doesn't feel compelled to be, has no interest in because of the way in which it's written. And I think stories are obviously hugely important, but I also think that these stories are deeply informative to let us know, like, this is what the women's movement has become. I break the book up into basically 4 parts. One of the main parts is what I call the lost girls, and these are all the girls starting with Mary Wollstonecraft, who have had all this kind of abuse and brokenness in their lives, and these are not accidental. These are actually pretty essential to why it is that they got to this point, where they're pushing for these different elements of feminism that we know today. So I think that these are essential pieces that people need to be aware of, and instead of just looking at them as sterile ideas. So yeah, it really served two purposes. One, I think it just conveys ideas in a much more malleable way than if I just went in there and started speaking, very philosophically. And two, I think it's just brings home the fact that there's some substantial brokenness here, and that's really what has been an engine behind feminism in a way that most of us don't expect or anticipate. We think it's a little bit more clean than it certainly is.
Right. So in this conversation, we're going to talk more about the early history because, like I said, that's some of the stuff that people are less familiar with. Now, I like to say feminism it's an Enlightenment ideology. It's really an offshoot of liberalism. It's an offshoot of individualism, rationalism too. You even see that in this book.
Yeah.
Can you situate things, generally speaking, feminism within its sort of Enlightenment origins?
Yeah, well, I think it all starts with the French Revolution. This is the sort of the context within which it emerges from Mary Wollstonecraft's work. She's, you have it, the French Revolution is going on, and you've got Edmund Burke, who has written a book called the Reflections on the Revolution in France. I think that's what his book is called. Mm-hmm. And he's writing and saying, this is a disaster. And Thomas Paine, who was actually a good friend of his at one point, is responding to it and saying, he writes a pamphlet called The Rights of Man. And Mary Wollstonecraft is a colleague of his, a friend of his, and she goes on and writes the Vindication of the Rights of Man. So she's just adding on to Paine's original title. And then from there, she writes The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So she's very much, in the Thomas Paine camp. And there's actually an incredible book Yuval Levin has written, and I don't know if you have seen it. It's called The Great Debate. And he basically says the debates that we're dealing with right now in the culture stem largely from this debate between Burke and Paine, where there's the conservatives and then there's the liberal side. So we can kind of see the trajectory of where this has gone, and where Mary Wollstonecraft is coming from. So certainly you have this idea of egalitarianism that Paine moves deeper and deeper into throughout his life, and ends up becoming called the first socialist, really. So she's moving in that vein and trying to, and it's clear from in the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she's trying to get rid of any kind of hierarchy in society. She thinks that the church is bad. She thinks that the military is bad. She certainly thinks the monarchy is bad. And what she wants is this very egalitarian sort of collapsed society, which is of course what Paine was arguing for as well, where men and women are equal, and there's no sense of any kind of hierarchy left in the culture. So that's really where things start. But you also have people like the Marquis de Sade, who's really pushing against taboos. You have Mary Wollstonecraft's husband, William Godwin, who's also pushing against the concept of marriage and really calls himself an anarchist. So these are the kinds of people that are moving in this world, and that Mary Wollstonecraft is within which she's writing. And of course, tragically, she dies 10 days after her daughter, Mary Godwin Shelley, who ends up becoming the writer of Frankenstein. 10 days after she was born, Mary Wollstonecraft passes away. But that's really the kind of the context within which she is writing and speaking about her own experience, and trying to, encourage women to become better and encourage men to become better. But again, in this very egalitarian kind of intellectual soup that she's working in.
Right, right. You talked a little bit about Mary Wollstonecraft's ideas, her intellectual context. What about her? What about her personal life? I mean, where are some of these things coming
Mhm.
from in terms of her relationships with men?
Yeah, no, and that's really the sad thing is just this life that she has. I mean, I think it's very difficult to hold her up as any kind of a role model because of just what her life was. I mean, she had horrible parents. She had an alcoholic father and a mother who really doted on her first son, and then the rest of the children. Mary was the second one born, and the rest of the children were sort of left under Mary's charge for over the years. And her mother was not a good mother. She was also very much abused by her husband and, the husband's alcoholism. They ended up moving a lot. He was very, he's one of these Jekyll and Hyde kinds of characters. There's this one story about him hanging the family dog. This is just really brutal, difficult stuff. And the family's really on the border of penury because of the fact that he can't keep a job and he's got all these debts and so they are constantly moving. Anyway, it's just a really awful picture of her young life. And she certainly finds some consolation in books and in ideas, and that's really where her career takes off. But at one point she decides she's going to go to Paris in the midst of the French Revolution, and while she's there she falls in love with an American. His last name was Imlay, and they end up conceiving a child together, and he doesn't marry her, but he tells the embassy that they're married, and that actually saves her from the guillotine. Otherwise she probably, like many of her friends, would have ended up being killed um, in the bloodiness of the French Revolution. So she has a daughter named Fanny. Imlay sort of leaves her. There's all this years of back and forth. Will he finally commit to her, on and on. And in the process, she finally realizes that he's moved on, and she tries to commit suicide twice, and finally kind of pulls her life back together again. And that's when she meets William Godwin. And this is a man who had a reputation and was very well known because he was against marriage and thought it was slavery. And so they end up having a relationship. She gets pregnant again, and they actually got married because I think Mary Wollstonecraft had this tenderness and felt like, you know, I've already had one child out of wedlock, and it's been very hard on this child. I don't want to do that again. And so they realize that there's something beneficial about being married for the sake of the child. And so they get married. And then, of course, she dies shortly after. And, Godwin is thoroughly an atheist. He didn't even go to her funeral. And he ends up, knowing that Mary has this reputation, and it's something to really capitalize on. And so he writes a book about her. And I think that's where we get so much of the knowledge that we have about her personal life, and especially the, committing suicide, attempts to commit suicide. But what's interesting is that when he publishes this book about her, it just totally killed her reputation. I mean, she just ends up becoming, people lose all respect for her. And I think you have to remember too,
Was
this
that
is a
not his
time.
intention?
No, it wasn't his intention at all. But I think the culture was so, I mean, this is a time when people who commit suicide, their bodies are dragged through town to show this is, the shame of it and whatnot. So you
Mm,
have to keep all of those pieces in mind that, the things that she did were incredibly shameful by that era's standards. I mean, obviously
right.
not by our own. But that was enough to just really destroy her reputation for a long time. And so it was really her son-in-law, Percy Shelley, who I think carried it forward in ways that, people haven't, nobody else was really paying attention to at that time, I think.
Right. I mean, and needless to say, it's not her fault that she had a terrible father. So that's not a criticism of
Right.
her. But when you look at
Of course
the
not.
picture throughout her life of her relationships with men, you get a picture of someone who maybe just isn't likely to have an accurate or healthy picture of what relationships with the sexes should look like, and any what the things that are good that she's saying are you know a little bit more abstract, probably because they're not rooted in good
Mhm.
healthy experiences. um
Mhm.
so
And
to
she
talk go ahead.
becomes kind of a template for all of the future women in terms of that vision of that. There's that kind of brokenness that is blurs what is really authentically good about men, and a deep understanding of that because of the brokenness of her own family.
Right. So to talk about her ideas a little bit more, what else can we
Mhm.
say that you didn't already mention? I mean, you mentioned egalitarianism. Now, I wanted to ask about this idea of like woman as a human being. So treating woman
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
treating woman as an
Mhm.
individual in the abstract, sort of
Yeah.
detaching her from her immediate context as a woman, because that's an important recurring theme.
Right. Well, I mean, just to go back to the idea of egalitarianism, what ended up coming out of this idea of egalitarian ultimately becomes this concept of smashing the patriarchy. So it sort of morphs into that. So I think she lays the stone for that idea.
Hmm.
And certainly not all of her work was bad, but one of the ideas that, like, as you mentioned, is this idea of humanity. I mean, she says repeatedly, "A woman is a human being," blah blah blah, over and over again in her work, and that's another piece that sort of sets the stage because this becomes a pattern that you see throughout the movement is this concept of woman as a human being, and of course she's using it in a very natural way to just distinguish us from a kind of slave or from an animal or something awful. She's not using it to start with in a disordered sense, but this is what really gets picked up and gets distorted with the movement, and it sort of creates this sort of meta reality of humanity and then male and female instead of humanity being male and female. So it's sort of this
Right.
higher sense of what humanity is distinct from what our sex is. And so this doesn't seem as important when you're talking about Mary Wollstonecraft in her era, but it becomes much more important as we move forward because this is what's being used by later on by the existentialists like Simone de Beauvoir and others, who will look to this sort of articulation of humanity as this distinct category that people can sort of just exist in, but they don't have to be male or female. So I think that's an important element. And there was one more thing I was going to mention related to that. Oh, I think the other thing that she did in terms of the movement itself, which is really to ask the question, how do we help women? And I think that that's the intention of so many of these feminists. I think it's the intention of so many current day feminists. I think this is really the desire. This is
Right.
what men desire. How do we help women? But the problem is that Wollstonecraft and everyone thereafter within the feminist movement really answers it in the wrong way, because she's answering it to say, how do we help women become like men? That's really what the focus is, not how do we help women as women with their
Right.
fertility and their marital issues and whatnot. So I think that that's another place, where she ignites things, or she's the spark for things, but she's not really the full blown fire. She's just the match for it, really getting things started.
You mentioned her dying
Mhm.
shortly after the birth of her second child, and so you do have a in-depth discussion of her family and her
Mhm.
husband and the relationship between her daughters and the obviously the famous romantic poet Percy Shelley.
Mhm. Mhm.
This might raise the question of like, well, why is this relevant? Because she wasn't
Yeah.
around, you know. um, I
Yeah.
think, well, first of all, one reason it's relevant is because Shelley's ideas, regardless of Wollstonecraft, Shelley's ideas become an influence on later generations, and
Mhm.
he was certainly something of a feminist figure himself in his own way,
Yeah.
and also because I think that one of the themes of the book is that is not just the badness of ideas, or that these ideas were inspired by people with bad experiences with men, because obviously somebody who if somebody comes up to an anti-slavery perspective because they were born into slavery, that obviously doesn't discredit the
Right.
anti-slavery
Right.
position. One of the
Mhm.
problems here is that we see over and over these ideas are failing to actually help them and to make them happier, and these ideas are failing to liberate them from this cycle of abuse with men.
Mhm.
And in the case of Mary Wollstonecraft, she marries this man Godwin, who you can say, as you mentioned in the book, maybe things were moving in a more positive direction because they recognized the need for some kind of family stability, despite being to some extent advocates of free love. Um, but she married this man who, as it turned out, basically would not protect their children from predatory men.
Mhm.
Not that he had no objection to, what was going on
Right.
with Shelley, but I mean,
Mhm.
again, look at the type of man she married. She didn't go from that and
Mhm.
say, I'm going to find. She didn't find the right ideal of a man to look for, as you were kind of
Mm.
saying.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I think
Right.
that's one reason why it's relevant. I mean, are there
Mhm.
any other reasons that you sort of decided to go into this whole thing of what the fate of her family after she passed
Mhm.
away?
Well, I think partially because it's just so fascinating how her ideas were carried out in ways that I think very few of us have any idea. I mean, I obviously had no idea,
Hmm.
but to see how again these seeds that she planted then finally germinated in the next generation because of what her reputation was, because that people thought these ideas were incredible, and because Shelley had sort of his own interest in them for, various reasons, most of them nefarious. So, yeah, I think it's just one of those things where you just think that how do all these people fit together, and how is this even
Right.
connected? And it's just this amazing story. So,
Well, it's
yeah,
like
I think
looking at
again,
Karl
it's
Marx and how both
going
of his daughters died in suicide pacts. you know.
right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are not inconsequential in terms of the story and these ideas, and obviously bad ideas and what they lead to.
Okay, well, why don't you we can get into Shelley's ideas in a bit, but why don't you
Mhm.
first tell a little bit about the of this story of what happened to the family after Mary Wollstonecraft
Yeah.
died?
Okay, so Wollstonecraft dies, and at that point, Godwin, he's got um, two daughters, one of whom is not his own, and then he has an infant, and he's encouraged to marry, and so he marries this woman who couldn't be any more different from Mary Wollstonecraft. I think she was not an intellectual woman. She had two children already from I think from different husbands or from different men. And so they get married, and suddenly he's got four children. But he has a wife, and they're making a go of it. And you can imagine things are very rocky. And but his reputation continues. I think there's he has a meeting with Aaron Burr, actually after he shoots Hamilton. Is that his name? Aaron Burr, right? Yeah, I have a
Yeah,
relative
yeah.
with the same name, so I had to make sure it was the right name. Anyway,
Right.
and so he continues writing and whatnot, but they have all this financial problem, and so this is becomes really the driver of most of his relationships, and this is why Shelley is sort of admitted to their family is initially is because Shelley has this promise of all this wealth that he'll have when his father passes away,
Right.
and this estate that he'll inherit, and so he's making loans based on that, which is
Right.
obviously sort of anomalous in our own culture, but
And Shelley
this is
Shelley
what he's
admires
doing.
Godwin. Why? What can you
Oh,
talk a little bit
tremendously.
more about
Well,
Godwin's
yeah.
intellectual life?
Yeah, no, absolutely, because he's trying to break the taboos. I mean, this is what Shelley is all about, is trying to break every taboo that's available, within grasp. And so Godwin has already done that by saying that marriage is a kind of slavery, and being an anarchist in general. So that's where the attraction comes from. So for Shelley, to meet the Godwins and to even to have this relationship with Mary Godwin is really remarkable, because of course he really loved the work of Mary Wollstonecraft, and of course the work of Godwin. And so to see a person who's hails from both these people biologically is really remarkable. And so what Shelley ends up doing is actually taking the ideas of Godwin and Wollstonecraft and putting them together and sort of creating, his own version of what would become feminism, based on this sort of adulation of these ideas, and then of course later his marriage to Mary Godwin.
Right. So what about his relationship with Wollstonecraft's daughters?
Yeah, so I think Fanny, who's the first one, I think she had a very troubled life and sort of felt like she was this sort of left out person, as you can imagine. Both of her parents are dead, and her father's not really her father, and I think there's all kinds of drama there, and she ends up committing suicide, people say, because Shelley seduced her, and she was so shamed by it that she commit
Hmm.
suicide. And so yeah, there's that element, and then I think there was certainly a closer relationship with Mary Godwin, but then when Shelley comes into the picture, he actually convinces Mary Godwin and her stepsister Claire, and I don't think anyway, convinces the two of them to run away with him. They go to France. I mean, it's this kind of nightmare scenario. It sounded all so lovely when he was pitching it to them. And this is while he's still married. I think his wife is pregnant with their second child. They go off to France on this horrible trip, and finally run out of money and have to come back to England. But at this point, Godwin stops speaking to Mary Godwin. They're not married yet, and Percy Shelley. But he's not above asking for money from them. So there's always this weird tension of, I don't respect what you're doing, even though you're actually living out what I have written about in my work, this rejection of marriage. But I want your money. So I will stay in close enough contact with you to keep asking for money. But I'm not going to, absorb you into the family with open arms because of this precarious situation of your current relationship and, the scandal of all of that. So that was something that was just became kind of the common relationship until Shelley dies. I think, there's some layers of acceptance, I think, over time, but even that the requesting money is something that he's involved with, from, asking money from Mary, his whole life, really. So yeah, there's this very odd dynamic going on between all of their relationships.
So Shelley has this menage with multiple Godwin daughters, and
Yes.
And more than one woman who's associated with him ends up committing suicide, right?
Yeah, there's a lot. His first wife commits suicide. Fanny commits suicide. There's dead children everywhere. There's actually one child that was born in Naples that he's actually, I think, called the father of it, but they don't actually know who the mother was. There's just, it's a mess. It's a hot mess.
Yeah,
And then of
and
course several
some
of their own children
biographers
died.
have thought that these children dying was basically, I mean, these were children who got ill and died, but that there was basically some level of neglect probably as well, because they were constantly traveling. They were not seeking the best conditions for the children, it was just a really chaotic life that they were living.
And they couldn't be in England because his reputation was so decimated because he was such a cad. So that was why they were always living abroad. And, he really looked up to Lord Byron. So there was there's some certain elements of trying to be like Lord Byron, or, to continue that relationship with him, which also included moving around and whatnot. So yeah, it was a really chaotic life that they lived.
Yeah, and you mentioned one of the other daughters gets involved with Byron because she's jealous of her older sister's involvement with Shelley. Yeah, it's crazy stuff, and I'm actually in a poetry discussion group where we're reading those two poets right now, so it's interesting to get this perspective. I mean, Byron was for people who don't know, Byron was not just a cad and a crazy guy, but I mean, like, basically, I mean, you read on his Wikipedia, you'll read about him, trying to purchase a 12-year-old girl from her parents in Greece, and all this really, really crazy stuff, that's taboo even today.
Right. And, I would add too, that none of this was filtered through any kind of people that were critics of these people. All of the resources that I used almost exclusively were either original sources or sources that were sympathetic to this situation. I mean, obviously there were some contemporary authors that I used, but these were not conservative Catholics who were, being critical of the Romantics. These were, New York Times authors who were being critical of it. So I think that's another important thing to recognize, is that this is that kind of unmitigated bad behavior that was on behalf of the Romantics, and people near and far recognize that.
Can we see Shelley as kind of like an archetypal? Sorry. Can we see Shelley as kind of an archetypal? Can we see Shelley as kind of an archetypal male feminist in the sense of not the kind of male feminist who maybe sort of like is cowed by women, but the kind of male feminist who liberates women basically in order to exploit them more readily?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole concept of free love. You've got a lot of de Sade's ideas are now floating around, and this breaking taboos, and all of that, I think is happening there. I didn't put it in the book, I don't think, but he actually presciently believed that there would be this erasure of the sexes. That was something that he sort of foresaw or anticipated or hoped would happen. But I think a better contrast that I probably didn't draw it well in the book, but it's kind of evolved as I've been thinking more and more about it, is that, while his wife is writing about Frankenstein and developing the creature and Dr. Frankenstein and that whole story, he's
Right.
creating basically this concept of the independent woman. And I know I mentioned her in the book. Sithna is this woman that he invents, but she becomes the model really for what we understand feminism to have become, and we can see this, the patterns of it emerging over and over and over again. But the three things that he really, puts into this person and puts into feminism, again, largely for his own personal gain, are this idea of free love, which of course he's living out like very few people ever imagined anyone could. And certainly those of us that look back to the early 1800s are not thinking that the scoundrel existed. I think we have a much more puritanical kind of notion, especially of someone who's such an, you know, um, a poet of such esteem. So free love is the first thing. Then he includes that idea of Wollstonecraft's, that what became smashing the patriarchy, this getting rid of hierarchy in the church and military and on and on. And then the third piece, of course, is his involvement with the occult. And I didn't go into that as much, partially because I thought the other ideas were important. But I think the occult is something that you can't skirt around. It was very active and an active part of his life. I mean, he was avowed atheist, but he would do things like spend the night in a coffin so that he could communicate with the devil. And it wasn't something that he shied away from because he was so ambitious to break taboos. And so that was absolutely part of his persona. So you can see all those three things sort of in the embodiment of this woman, Sithna, who would later become this role model. Certainly for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we can see it there, but there's other women in the interim that, certainly much more minor characters that people wouldn't know of, but that sort of are
Right.
passing this idea on.
Yeah, and again, this is another recurring theme throughout all of the stages of feminism. This
Mhm.
confluence with the occult. It's something we talked about when we
Yeah.
talked about your book on the anti-Mary. There's a book, I remember a book you cite in your book, that I
Mhm.
read an article about a few years ago by, I want to say he's Swedish. I'm not sure if he's Swedish or
Mhm.
Norwegian or something. Per Faxneld,
Swedish.
who,
Yeah.
yeah, and he wrote this book, Satanic Feminism, and he's not a Christian to my knowledge. He's a scholar who, I think, from what I remember checking him out a couple years ago, he's just done a lot of scholarship on the occult
Mhm.
and Satanism for whatever his reasons are. I don't know, but
Mhm.
so he's not writing this from a, I don't know if he's writing this from a critical perspective or not because I haven't read his book, but his book
It's
is
not
about sort
critical.
of the, yeah.
Having read it more carefully, I thought initially it was critical, but I think he actually embraces it. Is really where the motivation comes from based on footnotes, dedication, things like that I found in the book. It's certainly not a criticism. So yeah, he's
Okay, but he's
coming from
talking about
a very different perspective.
the satanic connections of
Hmm.
feminism from its early days. And this is not
Yeah.
specific to feminism. This is a big part. I mean, the
Mhm.
occult and ironically in this age of reason, the occult and, at least some form of philosophical admiration or literary admiration of Satan are very much,
Mhm.
this is very much going on in the French
Huge.
Revolutionary period, not to
Yeah.
mention, the Romantic period, the late 19th
Mhm.
century, with spiritualism, and also even in like the
Yeah.
sort of the 1920s and 30s, and then of course again in like the 60s and 70s, and again certainly again
Yeah.
now. Um,
Yep.
but I wanted to ask about um, Shelley's association of women with Satan and his new sort of female archetype of Satan that he develops. Because again, this is a recurring theme, this revisionist idea of the
Yeah.
Genesis story.
Yeah, no, this is really important. And again, like you said, comes up and it's very much in Katie Stanton's work. So he goes back to, and it's interesting because he has to go back to the beginning. I mean, you have to rewrite everything from the beginning if you're sort of trying to create this sort of new metaphysics about women and the way they ought to be treated and whatnot. So he sees the story of Adam and Eve as actually, this is, it's not actually a bad thing that Eve was tempted and they fell. He actually sees it as an opportunity, that the serpent was giving Eve an opportunity. He was giving her a kind of wisdom and a kind of knowledge that was very much something that we just have ignored, that women have all of this kind of wisdom because we listen to the serpent and whatnot. So yeah, there's definitely that sort of recasting of the story of Adam and Eve, and then sort of building from that. But that's just a key piece that comes out of Shelley for sure.
Right. So Satan is recast as this kind of like Prometheus figure to womankind,
Benevolent,
essentially.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and it's important to say too that you can't really compartmentalize sort of literary and philosophical. I don't know that Satan particularly cares in what way that he's honored and worshipped,
Right.
Whether it's in a sort of a people deluding themselves that it's just a literary and philosophical thing, or people who actually believe and know that he is real. And, whether people who are into Wicca or spiritualism, whether they think, well, Christianity has lied and he's really a good angel, and so we're going to seek favor from him. He doesn't care whether people embrace him openly under the traditional image of Satan as a figure of evil. Like it's all just going the same direction.
It's all good. Right. It's all publicity is good publicity for Satan, I think.
Right. So Shelley does this sort of revisionist version of Genesis, which will come about later. But now we're going to talk a little bit about people who are, I mean, the term feminism didn't come about, at the time of Mary Wollstonecraft. I think you said in the book that Engels was the first person to use that term. Is that right?
No. The feminism itself actually came from
Engels used patriarchy. Engels was the first person to use patriarchy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the one that made it a negative thing, instead of it having any kind of positive connotations that it had held previously. Right. He changed it. Mm-hmm.
So the term feminism emerges when?
In France, I don't remember exactly who coined it or what the era was. Okay. It was before Cady Stanton, probably I would say maybe 1850s or 60s. I don't really remember exactly.
No, correct me if I'm wrong. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they're not using the term feminism, but it's basically just agreed in general that they were early feminists. That's basically how it is.
Yeah, and I think they eventually used it later. But yeah, I think the bigger focus was the suffrage angle and really creating a narrative that they were the very first ones to be focused on this and really creating a brand for themselves, even so much as Cady Stanton sort of rewriting the Seneca Falls conference to include Susan B. Anthony in it, who was not part of it. They didn't meet until later after the fact. But Susan B. Anthony, Cady Stanton saw that there could be other competition and wanted to make sure that she was the one that was given credit for really being the foundress of it.
Okay, so like I said, in the sort of the Catholic feminist world, these two women are held up as important, forebears. Mm-hmm. So, well, for people who don't much about them at all, maybe you could just, what's the sort of standard view? What are we normally told about them?
Yeah, I mean, for the sake of time, I know that they are, like you mentioned before, they really are thought to be, pro-life, very benevolent. And I think by and large, we have this sense that feminism has been this benevolent force, but they're sort of the matrons of it that got it started and were promoting the vote. And, that was kind of it. There's not any of the baggage that was really associated with them. So those are the kinds of things that have been kind of airbrushed out of the story. And, it's obviously been very effective because most of us have had this sense that that's exactly how things went, I think. And so it's not until you really start looking, digging deeper and you realize that actually there was a lot more going on. And again, you see these ideas of Shelley sort of resurfacing, you see the occult resurfacing, and you certainly see this idea of, what that smashing the patriarchy kind of concept of this ideal of the independent woman, outside of the family, outside of children, outside of husband, all of those kinds of things.
What should be said about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony? beyond the sort of standard, women's
Yeah.
suffrage kind of thing.
Well, I think people need to really understand just the role that the occult played in their own work, and this is the time of the Great Awakening in the United States. It's after it's after the Civil War. You've got children dying from all kinds of disease, at the drop of a hat. You've also have all these people that have just died in the war, and people are really fascinated. Also, you have the technology is changing. There's the telegraph, and people can reach each other in ways that they couldn't before. So seances end up becoming this really big thing, this rapping on tables, these spirit tables that they call them, where it's basically, a medium would help people communicate, and the spirits would respond either through the medium or with knocking on the table. And that was one of the things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was just right in the heart of that. And she used the spirit table. That's where she came up with the idea for the Seneca Falls Convention. It's actually in the Smithsonian today. But that was something that was very much a part of who she was. She was raised a Calvinist. She ended up rejecting that and was actually very anti-Christian. And the spiritualism that she embodied or that she embraced was really worked so well with her own purposes, because of the fact that it got rid of pastors, it got rid of men, it got rid of any kind of masculine authority within the church, because you didn't need them anymore, because you suddenly had a female medium who was communicating with the spirits, and that was really all that was necessary for her kind of spiritualism. So that was a main piece. I think also she clearly wrote this book called The Women's Bible, which was, if you look at it, it sort of feels like an angry adolescent sort of just going through in a very juvenile way and making commentary every time there's a woman mentioned in scripture. And she wasn't the only author. There were other women that were involved in it, and all of them were involved in some degree or another with this group called, this esoteric spiritualism called Theosophy, which was sort of this cobbled together kind of religion. And so that was another important layer of it. So yeah, there were a lot of things that were going on that and I think people need to know too that Cady Stanton was really the mastermind behind all of this. She was home with her children. Right. She's the one that came up with the ideas, and Susan B. Anthony was the one that had the time. She wasn't married. She had a lot of time on her hands, and she was the one that could go out and speak to different groups, because Cady Stanton certainly couldn't leave home. So that's how they worked really as a team. But we know much less about Susan B. Anthony, because I guess one of her biographers burned for like over 4 days all of her papers, all of her letters. Right. So the biographers have been piecing together letters that she wrote that are in the possession of other people, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's right. letters from Susan B. Anthony. But we don't have a lot of that. And there was, all kinds of intimation that that she was a lesbian. I never found anybody say it outright, but there was a lot of intimation. There was one biographer that said that she had the warmth of her relationships with women that she that most women had with men. So again, I don't know. I didn't put that in the book, but that was sort of what was implied right. in various ways throughout it. So anyway, these were women who finally, they and there's also, of course, a lot of racism. I mean, fundamentally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was upset that men that were minorities were going to got the vote before she did. So that's sort of in their work. And then later on, they get embroiled in this huge scandal that, I explain in the book and is way too detailed to go into here. But they align themselves with this woman named Victoria Woodhull, who was a medium and very wealthy, very influential, very much a free love advocate. Because they thought they weren't getting enough attention. So they're like, why don't we have her come speak? And nobody will ignore us right. if we have Victoria Woodhull come speak. And so they did. And, it was just this huge scandal because she just voiced her opinions about free love and, all of this. So anyway, it was
Victoria Woodhull. She was the first female candidate for president, wasn't she?
Yeah. That's the very one. Exactly. So, Mrs. Satan is what the press had named her actually at that point. But, and actually right. Gloria Steinem, I think, had a picture of her, or maybe something autographed.
It was like a handwritten letter by her with a signature. That's it.
Yeah. In her office at Ms. Magazine. So all of these things led to the point though, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually got thrown out of her own organization because there was so much scandal associated with her. And I don't think people realize that, like, the suffrage movement was delayed literally for like 30 years because of the scandals that were created and because of all this infighting among the women. And anyway, it was really a disaster. And those are, again, also
Yeah.
pieces that are, don't normally make it into the history books.
Right. You also had a quote from Susan B. Anthony saying that when she was going around the country giving speeches, she was praying to the spirits to like become, because she wished she could become a medium, while
Yeah.
giving her speeches, to give better speeches. And what
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
what is the Seneca Falls Conference and the Declaration of Sentiments?
Okay, so that's the key piece. I mean, it's become very iconic in the feminist movement as sort of the the Magna Carta, if you will, of the movement. She had this idea with some other women of doing a conference, and so she sat down at her spirit table and came up with this idea of let's make a document. Ended up being sort of a mimicry of the Declaration of Independence. So she starts off with the intro of the Declaration of Independence and sort of adds her own, adds women into it and whatnot. And then she goes on and makes these requests. Curiously, she apparently was not the one that came up with the requests that women would make, because she was a upper class woman. She didn't know what women should be asking for necessarily, other than the vote. And so they came up with this whole list with the help of several men who were present. And it's some fundamental things like asking for the vote and asking for wages and asking for custody of children, some things that objectively needed to be rectified. If you start reading about how poorly women were treated if they tried to divorce a husband, and what happened to their children, and all of that was obviously very nightmarish. But that was really what became kind of the footprint of the movie. I'm sorry, of the movement, and where what kicked it off as an official movement, and even today is honored as kind of this sacred space. Curiously, I just found out recently that Father Baker, who built the Our Lady of Victory chapel or church, it's a huge church in Buffalo, New York. He also had an orphanage. He had, it's just this amazing spiritual force in the area. He had a home for unwed women. He had he discovered the biggest gas well that a resource that they are still using actually to this day, that he heated the whole organization through his discovery of this gas well. And anyway, he actually wanted to rename Seneca Falls Our Lady of Victory. So it's pretty interesting that he knew at that point that there was, Seneca Falls would have been better off if it had been renamed, because then it would be Our Lady of Victory would be the heart of the movement. But anyway, was just an interesting aside I just discovered.
Is there anything about the content of the Declaration of Sentiments from the Seneca Falls Conference that you would critique in terms of the grievances listed or the requests that are made?
I mean, the one thing that's really interesting is just to see what the grievances are, and to see how what really is happening is sort of the splitting up of the family. This is where it really starts in so many respects, because some of the things they're asking for about custody of the children, you can see when you split up the family, it's got to go to one parent or the other. And so they're asking for it to, obviously, the custody to go to women some of the time. But now you see, 150 years out, it's the exact opposite, that women are the ones that always get custody of the children, even when it doesn't even, that's sort of the benefit of the doubt goes to the woman. So you can see with this breaking up of the family unit, I think this is something that gets lost in all of it, because we sort of started thinking about women as these independent women, and so they're not connected to husbands and children anymore. But then the pendulum is going to swing the other direction. So, and obviously you could attach that to what happens with an abortion. Man obviously has no say in an abortion, very little say, except if a woman actually does have a child and she doesn't want him involved in her life, he still has to pay child support. All of these kinds of things. So it's interesting to see kind of this mess that's created when you abandon the family, because somewhere people are going to be shortchanged. And of course, we know too that the child is usually the one that is shortchanged the most. But yeah, I think that's sort of the most radical piece, is this element of trying to break up something that we see is so absolutely vital because of just the dynamics that human nature has created between man and woman, and child rearing and all of that.
Right. Yeah. And I was very struck by the point in your book because I knew about the Seneca Falls in the Declaration, but I did not know that the Declaration was literally written on that spirit table that she used to, to have seances, which again, you mentioned you can see in the Smithsonian. But yeah, anything else we should say before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've covered a lot of ground in just only the 1800s. I think, the big piece that we didn't, kind of the elephant in the room is just the connection that feminism made with communism in the 1900s, and that's obviously vital and pivotal and led to Betty Friedan's, positions in her book, The Feminine Mystique. But again, I think that the bigger point is just to see how these pieces have built on one another, and they're cyclical, and this real pattern has definitely emerged. And part of it is just like you mentioned, this idealization of the masculine and really trying to turn women into men. So it certainly shouldn't surprise us that we are now seeing this gender transitioning, and seeing it as something that's really emboldened those who are feminist and think that it's something that we should all be embracing.
All right, Carrie. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everybody. You can get The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us, at the link that I'll put in the show notes. I also want to recommend a great 2008 article by Dawn Eden. Now, Dawn Eden has gone down a little bit of an unfortunate path in recent years, but this article was great. I think it's called Eve of Deconstruction, but anyway, I'll link to it in the show notes. And in part, it's a discussion of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and just goes into some detailed quotes from them about their views and why they're not compatible with Catholicism. I'll just read a couple of quotes from them from the article, which I highly recommend reading in full. So Susan B. Anthony, one of her most famous things that she said: "There is not the woman born who desires to eat the bread of dependence, no matter whether it be from the hand of father, husband, or brother. For anyone who does so eat her bread places herself in the power of the person from whom she takes it." So there's this idea that being dependent on somebody else to provide for you is some kind of oppression or subjection. That's a bad thing. She said, "I declare to you that woman must not depend on the protection of man, but must be taught to protect herself, and there I take my stand." And so they had this idea that, you couldn't, rather than encouraging men to do better, they just said, well, we can't depend on men for protection, and therefore women have to become more like men and protect themselves. Anthony and Stanton both very much objected to the doctrine of original sin, and particularly the role of Eve in that coming about. And Stanton said, "The greatest block today in the way of women's emancipation is the church, the canon law, the Bible, and the priesthood." Anyway, so highly recommend checking out The End of Woman for more of this history, and also the article by Dawn Eden, linking to both of those in the show notes. Also, I would recommend, if anybody is not familiar with CatholicCulture.org, the institution that sponsors this podcast, check it out, because we've got all kinds of stuff besides podcast there. We have commentary, news, information for living out the liturgical calendar, a big library of Catholic documents, a lot of great resources and newsletters. I would recommend you go to the website and sign up for one of our email newsletters and keep up with what we have going on. Go to CatholicCulture.org for that. Everybody, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.